And yesterday, for the first time ever in the High Court in Gqeberha, Christopher Panayiotou
Late 2004, along the southeastern coast of South Africa, where Algoa Bay's waters lap against Port Elizabeth's shores, a story of love, ambition, and tragedy began to unfold. Port Elizabeth, South Africa's sixth most populous city and a major seaport, sits 400 miles from Cape Town, a bustling hub where the mundane and the tragic would soon intertwine. In November of that year, 18-year-old Chris Panayiotou had just graduated high school, stepping into what seemed like a predetermined future in his father's trading corporation. The family owned a considerable network of stores and eateries throughout the city and its surroundings. Chris wasn't just another heir falling into his father's footsteps. From an early age, he'd shown genuine interest in retail management, absorbing everything he could about the industry. His dreams, however, stretched far beyond being merely his father's apprentice. He envisioned owning his own fish restaurant near the prestigious five-star hotels along Marina Drive, and a sprawling supermarket in the heart of Kings Beach. That fateful afternoon found Chris helping at his father's modest diner on Market Street. The establishment, housed in a simple one-story building, lacked the glamour of his future aspirations, but held its own charm, particularly among local youth. It was here that Chris ran into a high school friend who extended an invitation that would change his life: a Friday night party at Barney's Tavern, a popular beachfront spot known for drawing the city's young crowd. Friday arrived, and Chris found himself at Barney's, settled in a wicker bamboo chair, nursing the establishment's specialty beer. His eyes wandered to the bar, where they found J.D. Dinks, also 18, sitting alone with a tall glass of lemonade. Something about her solitary presence drew him in. Perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps just youth's magnetic pull. But Chris left his seat and approached her. The connection was instant, electric. J.D. matched Chris's dynamism with her own gentle warmth. She possessed a sweet, cheerful disposition and an almost magnetic need to bring joy to others, a quality that would later lead her toward a teaching career. Their shared interests and easy conversation made the night fly by, neither realizing this chance meeting would spiral into a complex and ultimately tragic love triangle. As 2005 dawned, their paths seemed to align while simultaneously diverging. J.D. enrolled in university, pursuing her dream of teaching, while Chris, burning with entrepreneurial spirit, began building his own business empire. He started small, a local grocery store, then expanded to include a neighborhood restaurant and cocktail bar he proudly named Infinite. The name would later carry a dark irony, as nothing, especially not their happiness, would prove infinite. What had begun as a simple chance encounter at Barney's Tavern was about to evolve into something far more complex and ultimately devastating. In Port Elizabeth's close-knit community, where everyone's lives intersected like the city's busy streets, their story was about to take a turn that would leave an indelible mark on the city's history. In the early days of their romance, J.D. and Chris's relationship flourished like a well-tended garden. Their love seemed to deepen with each passing day, taking root in Port Elizabeth's sandy soil as naturally as the indigenous flora along its coastline. They carved out their own paradise, their days brimming with the kind of joy that makes young lovers believe in forever. But paradise, as it often does, harbored a serpent. Her name was Chanel Coutus, and she began as nothing more remarkable than another employee at Chris's store. For a year, their relationship remained strictly professional, bound by the mundane rhythms of retail management. But beneath the fluorescent lights of store aisles and between the shadows of office corridors, something shifted. What started with lingering glances evolved into something more intimate, more dangerous. Their colleagues noticed first the subtle dance of forbidden attraction playing out in plain sight. An enigmatic smile here, a gentle gesture there, meaningful glances across crowded store floors. The air itself seemed to crackle with unspoken electricity whenever they occupied the same space. Soon, local hotels became their sanctuaries, and during JD's absences, Chris even dared to bring Chanel into the home he shared with his fiancée. The irony was cruel. While Chris and Chanel's secret romance bloomed in the shadows, Chris and JD's relationship was celebrated in the light. To their families and friends, JD and Chris appeared to be the perfect couple. She, now a dedicated elementary school teacher at Nelson Mandela Bay, and he, a successful young businessman. Their engagement seemed the natural progression of an 8-year romance. But the weight of deception began to crack the foundation. Costa Panayotou, Chris's father, discovered his son's infidelity and confronted him at Infinite, the very establishment that symbolized Chris's success. The confrontation was explosive. Costa, seasoned by years in business, understood the value of reputation and family honor. His ultimatum was clear: end the affair with the sales clerk or face disinheritance. Chris made promises his heart had no intention of keeping. Even as he pledged to end things with Chanel, even as he walked down the aisle with JD in 2012, the affair continued. JD, still blissfully unaware, accepted a position at Rebecca College, her career soaring even as her personal life teetered on an unseen precipice. In Port Elizabeth's tight-knit community, where secrets had a way of surfacing with the tide, this dangerous triangle of deception couldn't remain hidden forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of perfect happiness, leaving behind consequences that would echo through the coastal city's streets for years to come. The sunlit beaches of Port Elizabeth had always drawn tourists to their shores, but beneath the surface of this picturesque coastal town, darker currents were stirring. As JD settled into her new role at Rebecca College, she remained unaware that her picture-perfect marriage was built on shifting sands, and that the man she loved was leading a double life that would soon unravel with devastating consequences. By 2014, the cracks in Chris's carefully constructed double life began to show, first in his ledgers. The cost of maintaining 2 worlds, expensive gifts for Chanel, clandestine hotel rendezvous, lavish treats, bled his business dry. The successful young entrepreneur was discovering that deception carried a hefty price tag, one that his once thriving enterprises couldn't sustain. As his finances crumbled, so did his marriage. JD found herself increasingly alone, inhabiting the hollow spaces of their shared life. The warmth that once defined their relationship had frozen into something unrecognizable. She confided in friends about her growing isolation, her voice carrying the weight of betrayal she couldn't yet name. Every attempt to rekindle their former closeness met with Chris's distant indifference. On September 21, 2014, reaching what she felt was her breaking point, JD took pen to paper. The letter she wrote that day would later become a haunting artifact of her final months. In those pages, she poured out her soul's deepest yearnings, the simple desire to be loved, to share the kind of marriage she'd always dreamed of. She wrote of wanting a normal man who would cherish her, support her, build a life alongside her rather than apart from her. Her words painted a portrait of a woman who sensed she was losing something precious but couldn't quite grasp what or why. She described her heart as torn and trampled, a painfully prophetic choice of words given what was to come. The morning of April 20th, 2015, dawned with the kind of crisp clarity typical of Port Elizabeth's early spring. At Staring Glad Village, where the Panayiotis made their home, 3 muscular men sat waiting in a rental car, their presence an ominous harbinger. Their target, a stylishly dressed young woman standing by the roadside, her posture betraying impatience. Through the rental car's tinted windows, they watched as a black BMW pulled up beside her. She slipped into the back seat, and the vehicle accelerated away, leaving the frustrated driver of the rental car to slam his hands against the steering wheel in apparent failure of their mission. Less than 24 hours later, at 6:15 a.m. on Tuesday morning, J.D. Panayotou left her house for what would be the final time. She headed toward Rebecca College, following the same routine she'd maintained throughout her teaching career. But this morning was different. This morning, she would never arrive at her destination. The timeline of these events, the mysterious men in the rental car, the black BMW, J.D.'s final departure, would soon become crucial pieces in a puzzle that would grip Port Elizabeth's community and lead investigators down a dark path of betrayal, conspiracy, and premeditated malice. That April morning stretched into an eternity of mounting dread. J.D. stood by her BMW, waiting for Cheryl, her colleague and friend. The same rental car with tinted windows from the previous day caught her eye, but she dismissed it, focusing instead on her phone to call her tardy friend. In that moment of distraction, two figures emerged from the roadside bushes. A split second that would change everything. 10 minutes. That's how late Cheryl was that morning. 10 minutes that would haunt her forever. When she arrived at their usual meeting spot, J.D. was nowhere to be seen. Her calls went unanswered, each ring echoing with growing desperation. The house stood silent against her knocks. By the time Rebecca College confirmed J.D.'s absence, the first tendrils of panic had taken root in Cheryl's heart. At 10 a.m., she made the call that would transform a disappearance into a citywide search. Port Elizabeth mobilized immediately. Police units, K-9 teams, and volunteers combed the area, their hopes diminishing with each passing hour. As night fell over Algoa Bay, the city held its collective breath. Morning brought renewed determination and increased rewards for information, but it was Angel, a police dog, who would make the devastating discovery in a bushy ravine near Quano Bushley. J.D. lay fully clothed, the scene staged to suggest a robbery gone wrong. Her bank cards and jewelry missing, a crude attempt to mask the true motive. The medical examiner's findings told a different story. 2 calculated shots to the back, 1 final shot to the head. This wasn't a random act of violence or a robbery turned tragic. This was an execution. The news of J.D.'s murder sent shockwaves through Port Elizabeth. How could someone extinguish such a bright light? This young teacher who had touched so many lives, whose only crime was wanting to be loved, whose last written words spoke of a heart already broken before bullets tore through it. Social media erupted with grief and outrage. The story spread across South Africa, a tragic testament to lives cut short by senseless violence. But in Port Elizabeth, the loss was personal. Every student who had sat in her classroom, every colleague who had shared morning coffee with her, every friend who had listened to her hopes and fears, they all carried a piece of the burden. On October 22nd, the Catholic Church could barely contain the crowd that gathered to bid J.D. farewell. Port Elizabeth turned out in unprecedented numbers, the cemetery filled with faces both familiar and unknown. Her students came clutching hand-drawn cards, their young hearts struggling to comprehend the absence of their beloved teacher. Colleagues stood silent, remembering her last day at Rebecca College, wondering if they had missed some sign, some cry for help. As the city mourned, investigators began piecing together the puzzle. The rental car with tinted windows, the mysterious BMW, the calculated precision of the attack. This was no random act of violence. This was premeditated murder. And somewhere in Port Elizabeth, perhaps even among the mourners at her funeral, walked the person responsible for orchestrating J.D.'s death. Even at J.D.'s funeral, the wheels of justice were turning. Sharp-eyed officers from the South African Police Service noticed something off about Chris Panayotou's performance of grief. It was his eulogy that truly raised red flags. What should have been heartfelt words of loss instead rang hollow, plagiarized from Charles Atkin's dedication to his late wife. While not evidence admissible in court, it was enough to make investigators take a closer look at the grieving widower. The first breakthrough came with the arrest of Laton de Sion, a security guard from Chris's nightclub. Under questioning, de Sion revealed a chilling plot. Chris had approached him seeking hired killers, and he had connected him with 3 associates. The investigation accelerated when surveillance footage showed 2 men attempting to use JD's bank cards after her murder, men whom de Sion identified as his recruited killers. In a classic investigative strategy, authorities released de Sion with a mission: gather concrete evidence of Chris's involvement while wearing a wire. The recorded conversation that followed would prove devastating. In those few hours, Chris Panayotou revealed himself completely, unwittingly confessing to orchestrating his wife's murder. 2 hours after that damning conversation, police moved in for the arrest. The dominoes fell quickly after Chris's capture. His detailed confession led to 3 more arrests, and the timeline of the murder plot emerged with horrifying clarity. Chris had scheduled his wife's execution for 6:30 a.m. on April 20th, 2015, knowing her routine of waiting for Cheryl. In a cruel twist of fate, their first attempt had been thwarted when Cheryl arrived early the day before, an unknowing guardian angel buying JD one more day of life. The investigation revealed not just a murder, but a carefully orchestrated assassination designed to appear as a robbery gone wrong. The missing jewelry, the attempted use of bank cards, all staging to mislead investigators. But Chris had made the same mistake many perpetrators do, underestimating the tenacity of law enforcement and the weight of his own guilt. The irony was bitter. JD's last written words expressing her longing for love had been penned while her husband was plotting her death. Her final morning routine, waiting for Cheryl, had been carefully studied and exploited by the man who had once promised to protect her. April 21st, 2015, 6:15 a.m., the moment when meticulous planning met brutal execution. The killers had learned from their previous day's failure, adapting their strategy with cold efficiency. Rather than risk the exposure of a public killing, they chose abduction, a decision that would give JD additional minutes of terror. The attack was precisely coordinated. 2 men emerged from their hiding spots, their movements rehearsed, their grip professional. JD, caught completely off guard, had no chance to fight back as they forced her into the waiting vehicle. In those terrifying moments, her world contracted to the space between 2 strangers in a speeding car. Her final attempts to negotiate for her life met with stony silence. For 30 minutes, they drove northwest of the village. 30 minutes during which JD might have thought of her students waiting for her at Rebecca College, of Cheryl, who would soon arrive at their meeting spot, of all the moments she would never see. The car turned onto a dirt road, the woods swallowing any hope of rescue. The ravine they chose would become both execution ground and temporary grave. 2 shots, methodical, practiced. Then the grotesque theater of staging a robbery, taking her jewelry and cards with hands still warm from pulling triggers. They covered her body with brushwood, a hasty attempt to buy time before discovery. Their attempts to use her bank card, first successfully withdrawing $100, then failing due to an incorrect PIN, would later become crucial evidence. The surveillance cameras that captured these transactions served as silent witnesses, their footage eventually helping to seal the killer's fate. The trial, beginning October 11, 2015, captivated South Africa. The prosecution built their case methodically. Financial pressure from maintaining 2 relationships, the strain of mounting debt, the calculated nature of the crime. But it was Chanel Coutis's testimony that brought the human element of betrayal into sharp focus. She detailed the expensive gifts, the nights spent in Chris's bed while JD was away, the passionate hotel rendezvous. Each word another indictment of Chris's character. The evidence mounted. Phone records between the killers and La Tentacion, ATM footage, GPS coordinates of the murder vehicle, all forming an irrefutable chain of guilt. The financial troubles that drove Chris to murder became clear through bank statements and business records, painting a picture of a man who chose murder over facing his own failures. The courtroom revelations painted a damning picture of a man who viewed murder as a solution to his financial woes. Chris Panayiotu's decision to eliminate his wife rather than face his own failures marked him as something worse than just a faithless husband. It revealed him as a calculating killer who placed money above human life. The trial took an unexpected turn with the mysterious death of the third defendant before proceedings began. His silence would forever lock away potentially crucial information, adding another layer of darkness to an already shadowy case. But even without his testimony, the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, financial documents, surveillance footage, and Chanel Coutis's devastating testimony formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. The verdict was decisive. Life sentences for Chris and the two surviving hired killers. La Tentacion's cooperation with law enforcement earned him consideration in sentencing, though he would still face consequences for his role in the conspiracy. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the kind, devoted teacher who had touched so many lives. But the story wasn't over. On December 9, 2019, another tragic chapter unfolded with the mysterious death of Costa Panayiotu, Chris's father. The same man who had confronted his son at Infinite about the affair with Chanel, who had threatened disinheritance, who had tried to prevent the tragedy that would eventually unfold, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. The timing and nature of Costa's death added yet another dark question mark to the family's tragic history. The investigation into Costa's death remains open, with whispers of connections to his son's case echoing through Port Elizabeth streets. If Chris was indeed involved in his father's death, it would reveal an even more monstrous dimension to his character, a man capable of orchestrating not only his wife's murder, but also his father's elimination. Today, JD's former students still remember their teacher's warm smile. Her colleagues at Rebecca College speak of her dedication to education. Her friends recall her letters, particularly that final September missive that unknowingly chronicled the last months of a doomed marriage. And in Port Elizabeth, where the waters of Algoa Bay continue their eternal rhythm, her story serves as a tragic reminder of how greed and betrayal can destroy lives. Chris Panayiotu sits in prison, his life sentence ensuring he'll never again walk the streets where he once dreamed of building an empire. The business ventures he killed for have crumbled to dust, and the two women whose lives he tried to juggle have moved on, one to the grave, the other to a life far from the shadows of his crimes. Some questions remain unanswered. The full extent of the conspiracy, the true depth of Chris's depravity, and the circumstances of Costa's death. But one truth stands clear. A man who chose murder as a solution to his problems will spend the rest of his days paying for that choice, while the community he betrayed continues to mourn the bright light he extinguished that April morning. This case stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lurk not in dark alleys or among strangers, but in the hearts of those closest to us, those who have promised to love and protect us. JD's story, tragic as it is, serves as a warning about the devastating consequences of greed, betrayal, and the human capacity for evil masquerading as love.